Just wait a sec. So yeah, for the benefit of the recording, this is week 4. This is the code along in week 4. And we're going to be looking at some data from the Tidy Tuesday project, which is what we've done every week. And we're going to look at the fisheries data set. So I'll just share my screen, just make it full screen so you can see it better. So as usual, this might be a little bit blurry initially because of Zoom. It will take within a minute it should work. If it's not, if it's still illegible after a minute or two, let us know and we'll see what we can do. But the yeah, this is my RStudio project. And I just want to mention, just flag at the beginning, that this thing here at the top, if you don't see this when you're working on things for this course, if you're watching this in the future, by the way, if you're like from a future version of IDS, ignore this bit. And also hello, thank you for watching this old video. If you're currently in 2021 on this course and you don't see that there, it means you are not working in the course workspace. And that means that you are not using, like you're using your own personal time, as it were, coding time. And you have to pay for more if you run out of it. Please don't do that because the university has already paid for this service. You do not need to pay it again. And the way you access that is by going here. This also should solve most problems with packages not being installed. So with that in mind, let's have a look at our R Markdown file. And I'm just going to check as usual. I want to preview it in the viewer pane, and I do want the chunk output console. Let's remember that. So let's knit this sort of sample thing. As ever, you can code along with this if you would like. The repo is pinned to the top of the IDS organization on GitHub. This week, this is actually from this week's Tidy Tuesday, where it is data on global fishing. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 data frames. That's a lot. So we're probably going to want to do some joining later on, but I'm actually just going to focus on one of these that I think is perhaps the most interesting to show a bit of coding with. So the first thing we need to do, and this is a thing just to bear in mind, is that you need to always make sure when you start working that you run this code chunk. If you don't run this code chunk, it might be, and I talked about this in the video at the beginning of this week, if you don't run this code chunk separately as well as knitting, all of these tidyverse functions won't exist. It just won't know they're there. So you'll get errors. I don't know why spell check keeps appearing. I hope that will disappear. But let's now load the data by running this code chunk. And we should see in the environment pop up lots of things here. So here are all of our data frames. So let's have a look at, oh, one other thing I'll just mention, because I think this is a neat little trick. If you want to run a single line of code, so instead of running a whole code chunk, if you just want to run one pipeline or one operation, there's a quick way of doing that, which is that if you put your cursor in the line, so don't highlight anything, just make sure it's just blinking like that. Hold down, it's Control on Windows, it's Command on Mac. So hold down whichever of those keys and press Enter, and it will just run that line. And that's really useful because it means, for instance, that if you have a pipeline, you want to debug it, you can put a hash in to break a pipeline. So say, ignore this pipe operator and just stop here. And then you can just run the pipeline up to where you broke it. So it helps you to sort of see what every step is doing if you're trying to debug code. So yeah, the data frame I'd like to look at is the consumption note. Let me just check my notes. Other one, it's the production data frame. So let's have a look at it. So this data set has, I mean, for a start, I'm going to have to minimize this so we can see it because the names are so long. These are not useful names. I mean, yeah, they're great information, but this should be in a data dictionary, really, I would say. This as it is not useful because it's just taking up space and we can't refer to that name. We can, but having to cite commodity balances, livestock and fish, primary equivalent, freshwater fish, 2761 production, 5510 tons with all of the right punctuation and capitalization is not going to be fun. So we'll fix that in a minute. The data includes, so it has some entities, and it's using entity because these aren't all countries. So we've got Afghanistan is the first one, but then Africa. We've got a country code. You remember we had those 3-letter country codes last week. I think it's the ISO ones again. So we've got a country code, but obviously things like Africa doesn't have a country code because it's not a country. We've got years, and then we've got the amount of sort of production, so the amount of fish caught of each, or fish or other marine livestock, of these 7 different types. So pelagic fish, apologies if I got the pronunciation of that wrong, I'm not a biologist, crustaceans, cephalopods, demersal fish, freshwater fish, mollusks, and marine fish other. Mollusks other and marine fish other. So what we can do, so there's a couple of, does anyone have a suggestion for what I might want to do with this data set?
Post in chat what you think we should do with the columns, you mean?
With the columns, yeah. Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to do, and I'm going to do both of them, but so remove the code column I could do, I might as well leave it for now. It's not doing any harm. Rename the columns is definitely something we want to do. So let's do that first. So let's put a thing saying, let's start a new code. Let's start a new section of this file called data cleanup. Let's start a new code chunk, which is our cleanup, and let's clean this up. So this was the production one. And the first thing I want to do, so you might remember that last week we used the janitor package. The janitor package is a really useful one for sort of cleaning, standardizing column names. Thing is, it's probably not much use to us this week. It will be useful for those first 3 because it'll just put them in lowercase, which is handy. But with this, it's still going to be all these words. It's just going to be all in lowercase with underscores, and that's not helpful. So in this case, there's not much point loading another package when we don't need to. We might as well just manually rename them because we're going to have to do that anyway. We've got production, and I'm not going to type all this out because I have already done this, and it'll take a long time for me to type it all out. So I am just going to copy and paste. I'll need to modify it a little bit because my what I did wasn't quite right, but I'm just going to do the anyone watch Blue Peter? This is the here's one I made earlier. We don't have these columns because I copied this from a joined data set, but these ones we do. So I've renamed entity. So the rename function, each argument is what you want the column to be called, then equal sign, then the current name. That's the syntax for this. So the entity and code, I've just made them lowercase. For year, I've made it YR. And the reason I've done that is that there is a year function in the luridate package that we might want to use, and having a column called year and a function called year could be a bit confusing. So let's just call it YR. And then these, and you can see why I prepared this earlier. I'm actually going to change this because that really should be other marine fish. But I've just put balanced pelagic fish, balanced crustaceans, balanced cephalopods, balanced demersal fish, balanced freshwater fish, and so on. So let's call that production. We don't really need to do any other data cleanup on this, so I'm just going to say production cleaned is that. So let's run that code chunk. And it doesn't output anything because I assigned it. When you assign something, it doesn't print anything. But now we have our same data set, but with these slightly more workable column names. So one thing you might do if you were working with this, I might have abbreviated this to like pelage or crust or whatever. And actually, that's what I did do when I was sort of prepping for today. The reason I didn't is there's another thing I want to do where the column, it might be useful to have column names written out in full. Can anyone think what that might be? You don't have to give every column, by the way, when you're renaming. You just have to it's just the ones you want to rename. It's just in this case, I did want to rename all of them. So does anyone think what I might want to do? So I've got lots of columns with lots of different things that are essentially counting the same thing, right? So like, these are all just counts of number of, it was tons of fish caught of different types, all in separate columns. Not vectorize exactly. This is something you saw in the lab on Friday, where, do you remember you had the different years across different columns? Pivot, yeah, very good. And do I want to pivot longer or wider? Longer, that's correct, yeah. So generally, you'll use pivot longer a lot more than pivot wider, because things like ggplot need your data in long format. Occasionally you pivot wider. I gave an example of when you might last week, which was when I wanted there to be one observation per country per year, I think it was, or was it whatever? No, it was per medal, I think, per medal one. I wanted one entry per medal one. I didn't want to end up duplicating that. And that meant that I couldn't go longer because that would have made lots more columns. So yeah, we want it to be longer here. That will make it much easier to do like a ggplot. So let's do that. So we will start with our clean data set, so production cleaned. The reason I'm saving that is, maybe I do want the wider one so if we look at some of our other data sets in here, like farmed, these have one entry per country and year and code, although that maps to country. So if I were going to join these data sets, then yeah, I probably would want the wide format, at least initially, because that has one entry per country, code and year, and I probably want one observation for country, code and year. But in general, we don't. So some of that's a really good. Oh, and David's answered it. No mind. I will say this out loud for the benefit of the recording because I think it's important. The backticks are used whenever you have a sort of non-standard column name. So it's just a number or has spaces or anything like that. The backticks tell it this is all one big column name, and that's another reason that it was good to rename these, because that's annoying that you have to do that. So you really don't want column names with space in if you can help it. It just happens sometimes when you load data. But okay. So
notice, sorry, Alex, just jumping in. Notice how what Alex renamed them to has those underscores, and that's what's known as what's it known as? It's not camel case. Snake case. I lost the word as I was saying. It's known as snake case. So that way there's no spaces in the names. It's much easier for R to be able to figure out that that's all one thing rather than having the back teams. That is camel case indeed, as Alex has put into the chat. Thank you.
But camel case is not standard for R. It is in some other languages. Standard for tidyverse is usually underscore. Standard for certain base R functions and so on is to put a dot between words, but that's kind of a little bit deprecated now. But you'll still see that in things like install dot packages or the na.rm option of things like the median function. So we want to pivot longer. So we want to pivot this longer, and pivot longer. Pivot longe isn't a function. Pivot longer. And what we want to do is just have a look at so I couldn't remember the syntax of this. So I've typed question mark pivot longer so I can have a look at the documentation. And what we'll see here is we need the two really key arguments are the columns and the columns that we want to pivot, the names to, and the values to. So there's a few ways to do this, but the really key thing is actually all of the columns that I want to, I've been, if I say so myself, quite clever with my choice of column names, because every column that I want to pivot starts with the word balance. So we can select those columns by using starts underscore with balance. And that's, so starts with is a selection helper function, so you can use it inside the select function. But you can also use it inside things like pivot longer. You can only use the starts with function and the ends with function and related functions to select column names. It does not work if you try and use it to select, like to filter. It only works when selecting columns. But anyway, so we want the ones that start with balance, and the names. Where do we want the column names to go? What might we call that? Any thoughts? What might we call a column that is for all of our column names? So our column names, things like balance demersal fish, and balance other mollusks. Any thoughts? Put them in the chat. I'm genuinely asking. So it's not going to be the weight, that's the values, but yeah, let's go with fish type. I went with category, but it was a bit vague. So I think I prefer, yeah, fish type or type of fish. It's a little bit, I was sort of not sure about that because mollusks aren't fish, but this isn't a biology course. So let's go with fish type. Type of fish would also be fine. They're all very similar. Okay, and so that's the column that we want to put our column names in. And then we also want a column for all of those values that were in the table. So what might we call that? Oh, marine type. Oh, well, I suppose it's not really a marine though. A marine is like a sea, isn't it? Oh no. Well, let's go with it. What the heck? Marine type. There we go. Yeah, we're not fishing for like marines in the military sense. That would be strange. What would the for the benefit of the recording, that was a response to something in the chat. I didn't just think of that. Values 2, what are we going to put there? Any thoughts? So our values 2 is the column where all of the I mean, there's a load of NAs here, but like, let's say for Africa, well, all of these, yeah, here's the data frame. And the original data frame, which might help you, is that one. So what are we going to put as our any thought? Yeah, balance value, yeah, or production balance, or production, or something on those lines. Because this is going to be the column for all of these values, which were all kinds of like commodity balance and production. So let's go with balance. Just so it's a little bit shorter. So if we do that, and I'm going to do that Control Enter thing again, so we don't run this bit again, we just run this second bit. That's almost what we want, I think. The annoying thing though is that our marine type all has balance on the beginning, because that was on the beginning of all of our columns, and that's how we chose which columns to select. Turns out there's a really nice extra option we can use in Pivot Longer, which is the names prefix option. And we can say names prefix equals balance underscore. And if we run that now, it tells me that I misspelled names prefix. So let's try that again. There we go. So if we run that now, the balance underscore has disappeared, because we've told it actually all of these columns start with that. That was just a sort of way to identify what these columns were measuring, but we don't actually want that to be in our column. Now, if anyone's worried, by the way, about all the NAs in the balance column, that's totally fine. That's just because our original data set happened to start with lots of NAs. Not much we can do about that.
Alex, can you just show us?
Yeah.
I actually haven't followed with the balance thing. So can you scroll up to the top a little bit and let me see when you were renaming it? Why did you add balance in front of them? Are there some columns you didn't want to use?
Yeah. So the columns that I didn't want to use, I'll just show you the text here. So entity, code, and year, I didn't want to select. So entity, code, and year are not measures of sort of commodity balance, right? They're the country, the code, and which year we're in. And those also happen to be the things that I don't want to pivot into one column. So what I did when I was renaming the columns was I made them all balance underscore something, so that, I mean, A, that's just helpful for me to remember what all of these columns are, but B, it means that when I want to select all of them, it's really straightforward to do so.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, I follow now. That's great.
And then I removed that when I was pivoting because I don't actually need that anymore now that I've got just a balance column. So I'll do one more thing just to do a tiny bit more cleanup to this, because if we're going to do any plots with this, we actually want these. Can you put, someone asked if you can put multiple names in names prefix, which is a really good question. I think the answer is no. So if you can't do that, you're going to have to do something like a manual mutate afterwards. And I'm about to do a mutate now, so you'll see an example of how you do that. So I've made it a little bit quicker by using that, but actually this isn't quite what I want, because when we're plotting this, we don't actually want this to be, we don't want like a legend for a graph, say, if we were plotting different types of fish. We don't want it to have pelagic underscore fish. That doesn't look very nice. So we actually want these, whereas we want our column names to be in snake case, we want these are just strings, and we just want them to be in sentence case, essentially. So here's how we're going to do that. So we're going to do a mutate, because what we want to do is transform that column. And we want to just overwrite our existing marine type column. We don't need a second column for the clean version. So marine type equals. And what I'm going to do here is something that's maybe you haven't seen before. In fact, I don't think you have. But it is something you can do. And this is a little bit more advanced. I'll tell you what, I'll do it in two ways. So we're going to want to start with marine type. Then the first thing we want to do to this is put it in sentence case. So you haven't seen this function yet, don't worry about this, but the function you need to turn it in sentence case is str to sentence. And if we run that, that's almost there. It's put capital letters at the beginning, but we still have the underscores that we don't want. And it turns out the function we need for that then is str replace. And again, don't worry, you haven't seen this function yet. This is coming up later in the course. And for that, again, don't worry, you haven't seen this yet, but the things it takes are a pattern that you want to replace, so pattern equals underscore, and a thing that you want to replace it with, so replacement equals space in this case. So I don't know about you, but I find that a bit hard to read now. This code, this whole benefit of piping has meant that I now, it was looking quite good. I could follow what was going on, but now we've got this horrible statement here. So what I'm going to do is put a pipeline inside a pipeline. So inside this mutate statement, I'm going to start a new little mini pipeline just for manipulating the variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put marine type equals marine type pipe. And then the next function I want to apply is this inner one. So I want to apply string to sentence pipe. And then what I want to do is string replace, but take the pattern equals underscore and replacement equals that. And if we do that, this has almost worked. Can you see where it hasn't worked?
Oh,
yeah.
I see it. I see it. It's on one of the lines. Can anyone?
Yeah, I'll just say.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just say, by the way, someone said, could you do multiple column names? And I forgot the answer. And thank you to the person in the chat who put that. You can do using something called regular expressions. You can use that to specify you want this or this. I think we do talk a little bit about regular expressions towards the end. They're a more advanced topic, and we're not going to go into them in a huge amount of detail. They're also famously difficult to get working. But yeah, so that's the problem, is that it's only replaced one of them. So we now need to know how we're going to do that. So it turns out I need the function string replace all, not string replace, because string replace will just replace the first one it finds. So string replace all, there we go, it does it. Right.
So Alex,
yeah,
we said earlier that we don't want spaces in some of our stuff, but you've added spaces.
Yes, I have.
Why have you done that?
Why have I done that? Well, so the reason we don't want spaces is that we don't want spaces particularly in variable or column names, because it means that we have to, it makes our code less readable, and it means that we have to put backticks around things to make them work. Here, though, these things are all now, because we've sort of pivoted, these are now strings, so they'd normally be surrounded by, I'll just put it here. Really, you can think of that, it doesn't display it that way because it's trying to make it more readable, but really that first entry is this. So we already have to put quotes around it. So it doesn't really matter now what it is. It doesn't matter if it does have underscores in for the benefit of sort of the coding, but it also doesn't matter if it has spaces in and all sorts of capital letters and whatever, which kind of tips the balance. So before we were doing what made our code easier to code, but now it doesn't matter. Our code is as easy to code whether we have spaces or not, when we have it as like entries in a column. And we already, in fact, if you look at the entity column, there's going to be spaces in there, right? So any country that has multiple words, if we go right down, yeah, there we go, South America or Southeastern Asia have spaces in them already. So we've already got to deal with this. And the reason that the balance is tipped is we can now use those the entries in a column to be in, say, a legend in a GG plot. And when we've got a legend, we want things to be readable, right? We want that now to be readable to someone who hasn't been coding, someone it just, it would look weird if you saw a graph in like a textbook or a newspaper article or whatever that just had underscores all over in the key because the person had done it in R and couldn't be bothered.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that you were going to add, you were adding the spaces because then when you're like data cleaning for when we do our graph, then our graph is nice and pretty.
Correct.
It doesn't have things with underscores because, as you say, that's the difference between being nice and easy to use for the code and then being nice for when we present it to others in our graphs.
So spaces and observation names are okay in general from the chat. And also someone asked, can we use string replace, str replace twice? Yeah, we could have used str replace twice. In this case, because everything, there are at most two, but this is probably a bit neater, it's shorter, and it means that if I do change somehow, if I went back and tried to reuse this code, but I actually had other non-extinct marine fish, let's say, that would have another underscore, and doing this means that our code won't break. So this makes our code slightly more resistant to breaking if certain other things change. So we've cleaned our data a little bit. Now, what I'd like to do, and if you're still working on the homework, then this might be a thing to pay attention to. Some of these things are fish and some of them are not fish. And what I'd like to do is have a column that tells me whether they're fish or not fish. So let's have a go at that. So, I should have said, sorry, thing I've forgotten, which is a really easy mistake to make. And I've seen people make this when they've asked questions in the Piazza. I haven't saved this anywhere. I've just printed it, so I can't now use it in another code chunk. So let's change that to production longer. Run that again. Okay, and let's just knit the document to make sure everything's working. It might not like this blank code chunk. We'll have a see. Oh, no, it's fine with it. It just doesn't print the blank code chunk. There we go. Cool. So it's not outputting anything, but that's fine. Okay, so I'd like to have a new column for whether or not some things are fish. So I'm just going to start my production longer. And what I want to do is I want a new column, so I need to mutate. That's just a standard thing for a new column. There we go. And let's call this is fish. And what I want to do is I want to know whether or not my thing is fish or not fish. So there are 3 things here that are not fish and 4 things that are, so it's going to be easier to test for whether things Well, okay. So what I'm going to do is a slightly simpler version of what I could do, but I would need code that, again, I don't want to introduce lots more code that you've not seen yet. So what would be ideal, and I'll put this in the version that goes online, is that I would like to just select any, mutate, test for if something ends in the word fish and make is fish, fish. And if it doesn't end in the word fish, make it not fish. That involves a little bit of regular expressions, and that's why I don't want to do it today, partly because I'll make a mistake. So I'm going to do this manually. I'm going to say that I want to test whether something is crustaceans, cephalopods, or other mollusks. And if it's not one of those things, then it's fish. And if it is one of those things, then it's not fish. So my new column is going to be called is fish, and I'm going to use an if else statement for this. So if we look at the documentation for if else, someone's put a real regular expression in the chat. I'm just looking away, but the if else here takes 3 arguments: a condition, true, and false. And it's just worth pointing out, I'm sorry, this is confusing. This true, because it's in lowercase, that is an argument of this function called true. So this is like names to or values to. It's not the same as true in caps, which means the value true. So if you put this in caps, it won't work. It has to be, in this case, in lowercase. And it's one of the only times that you're going to use the word true in lowercase. Yeah, sorry. So as an example of using this, what we want to do is we want to see if the entries in our marine type column are in this vector. So we want to see if any of them is, what were the 3 things I said? Lost my, let's look at my viewer. There we go, it has them in. So if they're in, let's remove clean these now. So if they're in, nope, crustaceans, cephalopods, or other mollusks. So if that's true, so what that does, the in operator is saying, check every element of this vector to see if it's in this vector. So what we can't do, just because this is sort of the obvious thing. It might
One
be
second before you move on, Alex.
Yeah.
Let's put in chat. What has Alex done wrong? To see, wait, Alex, you might notice it now. What has he done when he's created his vector that's going to cause an error?
Oh, good question. Good question.
Because it's really common. It's really easy to do.
Yeah, very good. Yes,
there we
thank
go.
you. Yeah,
it's all in one string.
Brilliant. Yeah. So that obviously, thank you, should be 3 strings. Yes, we can't do equals here. The reason we can't do equals is what that's going to do, and there are reasons you might use this, but rarely in this kind of statement. What that does is it creates a vector of the length of whichever is the longer of these 2, so in this case, marine type. And what it's going to do is it's going to say, is the first entry in marine type crustaceans? And it'll say true or false for the first entry of the output. Then for the second row, it will say, is the second entry of marine type cephalopods? Then it will say, is the third entry of marine type other mollusks? And then it's got to the 4th entry of this and it's run out here. So it'll go back to the start and it'll say, is the 4th entry of marine type crustaceans? Is the 5th entry cephalopods? Is the 6th entry other mollusks? So it's just going to keep looping around, but it's only going to check each entry of marine type for one of these 3. And that's generally not what you want. What we want to know is for every entry, is it one of these? So that's when we use in. And then we need these 2 true equals something and false equals something entries. So if that statement is true, what do we want here? So if an entry of marine type is in crustaceans, cephalopods, or other mollusks, what do we want our new column to say? Any questions in the chat? Thoughts in the chat? Oh, hang on. If it's one of those, is it fish? Yeah, it's not fish. So we could use true and false here. We could use, so it'd be a bit annoying because it would be true equals false and false equals true, which sounds like something from 1984. Because our is fish, we're sort of testing the opposite of what we're actually checking for. So one reason not to do that is that's very confusing. The other reason not to is then our legend, if we want to plot, fish and not fish, we'll just say true and false. And it's actually quite hard to change something from a logical vector to a character vector. You can get errors going on when you try and change the type of a vector. So we might as well just put, if it's true, then it's not fish. And if it's false, then it's fish. A case when would work as well. So a case when, I'll put an example of that when I write this up, how you do this with a case when. A case when is what you need to use if you have more than one condition, so more than two possibilities. Yeah, someone in the chat has pointed out they got exactly the problem that was mentioned with, yeah. So it's better to use character names generally for this. Right, so let's have a look at what that does. There we go. So pelagic fish is fish, crustaceans is not fish, spalvads is not fish. This is looking quite good. What we now want to do is I want to make a graph. So what I actually want to do, the reason I want this is that I want to find the totals for fish and not fish for each country. So what's the next thing I need to do if I want to find the totals by fish and not fish? Oh, is it count though? Because so let's see what happens if I do a count here. $72,000. We don't want to filter. What might we want to do? Group by, there we go. So we want to group by our new variable. So group by is fish. And also we want to group by something else because we don't actually want the totals for, we don't actually just want the total for fish and not fish. We also want to group by our other things too. So we want to group by our entity, our code, and our year. That might seem redundant because each entity maps to one code. The reason we're doing that is if we don't do that, when we do any sort of summarizing later, the code will get dropped, and it's probably handy to just keep the code floating around there. It's, again, doing no harm, and we might want it. Who knows? So we'll just include it for now. And then, do we want to count? I'm not sure count is the function we want here, because we don't actually want to count the number of entries. What we want to do is take a total on the balance. So which function might we want to use now? Anyone in the chat? Oh, I've just typed it. I just typed it. I was on autopilot. I've not had enough coffee this morning.
But what do you put in summarize?
Yeah,
that is the question.
Yeah. Think someone's so we could remove the NA, but I'm actually not going to here. And as my supervisor used to say, I'll tell you for why. The reason I'm not going to remove the NA here, so someone said actually in the chat, I think about a fraction of a second before David asked, it was sum. So we want to do the sum of the balance. And we need to give that a new name. So I'm actually going to, and hear me out on this, I'm going to call it balance. And that might seem, you might think I want to use balance total, but the next thing I'm going to do, which we might run out of time for, but have a look at the thing afterwards, it's going to be really useful if this column is just called balance again. And you're right, that's coming up with lots of NAs, but I actually want that. So firstly, we can check it's not all NAs. So let's just, for now, I'll get rid of this code in a minute, but let's filter for when the balance isn't NA. And there's loads of entries where it's not, starting with our second entity, which is Africa. The reason I'm not is, in Afghanistan in 1961, so if we scroll right back up to the top of this data set, in Afghanistan in 1961, we know that 300 tons of freshwater fish were fished. And we don't know how much pelagic fish, demersal fish, and other marine fish were fished. Now, I suspect the answer is none, because Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and I think all of those are ocean fish. But we don't know that just from these data. If we knew it was 0, it would say 0. What it actually says is NA. So what it's telling us is we don't know how much of those types of fish were fished. So unless I had evidence to the contrary, unless I had something that said NA actually means 0 in this data set, what this is telling us is we don't know. So if we were doing like a median, we might say, okay, if we're doing like a median, we might say, okay, well, we don't know some of our values, but we can just assume that our median is probably going to, close, even if those it's good. What we get when we do it with what we have is probably going to be similar to what we get when we do the median without. But that's not true here, because if this really were like 400, then our balance of freshwater fish would then be at least 700, our total sum. So putting 300 here would be just misleading, because it could be a gross underestimate of the total. So this is actually why the functions don't remove NA by default. Sometimes it's safer to, sometimes you really, really don't want to remove NAs. I think this is one of those cases. And in those cases, imagine what it did. Imagine what it did if na.rm was default to true. What would have just happened when I did this, I would have used the wrong code for what I wanted to do, and I would not have known. Because, if I just do that, all it would have done, if na.rm defaulted to true, I would have just said, oh yeah, that's my data set. And it wouldn't have given me an error or anything. There's nothing obviously wrong with that, but I've just ignored a load of NAs and I didn't want to. So by having the default the other way round, by having the default like this, it means, yeah, it's a bit annoying when that happens to you, but it's obvious if you aren't expecting a load of NAs, that's obviously wrong.
So is what you're saying, Alex, that the reason we want to keep the NAs here is because we don't actually know how many fish Afghanistan actually has, because that data was missing apart from the 300. And if we left 300 in, we might have the false impression. We might think, oh, they only fish 300 in 1961, but we don't actually know, because there's loads of missing data. Yeah, and my guess for Afghanistan is it's probably right, because as I say, I think the others are all sea fish and Afghanistan is landlocked, but I don't know that for the rest of the data set. And I don't, I could go through and make guesses, but then I'd have to disclose that I was going through and doing stuff with landlocked things that I wasn't doing with others, and data could be missing for all sorts of reasons in this data set. So I'm just going to say, I just don't know. So I'm going to do one more thing, which is, so I've got my totals now, and I know we've got these NAs, but I'm going to do one more thing. And this might seem a little bit odd, but I'm going to rename a column. You'll see what I'm going to do. This is probably the last thing I'm going to do, because we're running out of time, but I'll finish off what I was going to do again afterwards, and I'll stick it on the website. But I'm going to rename a column, and I'm going to rename isFish to marine type. And you might think, well, that's really confusing. Why have you done that? Because I've now just got columns that have the same names as my other data set, and this is a different data set, right? And that's exactly why I've done it. The reason I've done it is that, so I'll call this fish or not totals. The reason I've done it is that what I want to do now is this. I want to say, let's start with production longer. So I need to just run that again, so I save it. Start with production longer, and I'm going to do bind rows, fish or not totals. And that's going to work because these two data frames have exactly the same column names. And what this is going to do, and I'll just do an arrange statement to get the data back in the original order. So arrange by entity, then code, then year. So now in our table, we have two more entries after all of these marine types, which are fish and not fish. So again, for Afghanistan, that's maybe not as helpful. But if we just for now, if we filter to, let's say when you went Africa was fine. So entity equals Africa. We now have our totals in here for fish and not fish.
So that means that if we want to plot the individual fish types and the total on the same graph, we can do. So we could have a graph where we show all of our different types of fish, and we also show lines for the total number of fish caught and the total number of non-fish caught. So what I'm going to do when I write this up, I'm going to show you how you would do that using ggplot. And so one last thing to do before we go is I need to and oh, sorry, I'll do two more things before we go because we've just got time. So firstly, because this is now a little bit misleading, it's not obvious from this that some of these rows are just totals of other rows. So I'm going to put total not fish and total fish in there. So if we run that and then run that, there we go, it's better. The other thing I'm going to do is save this. So production with totals, let's call it. Okay, so there we go. That's what we've got to today. So what I'm going to do afterwards is do this plot. I'm going to show you how to do a plot where the totals are in, let's say, solid lines and the other types of fish are in dashed lines, so that you can see clearly that some of these lines are for the total and some of these lines are for individual categories of marine life. And that's what we've got time for.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording.